Hi everybody, Professor Jeff here. We are going to continue our journey through The River Speaks by Professor Jeff Knorr. We're here in chapter 3. So again, as always, you can follow along with your book if you have one at home. You can follow on the screen, or of course you can just listen to this, like an audiobook or like a podcast, whatever you'd like to do. But I will be mentioning the page numbers as I'm starting here on page 19. So chapter 3 is literary criticism, critical approaches to meeting a poem. When reading poetry, there are many ways we might meet a poem on the page, and often, as already discussed, we will first wade through the language, reacting and responding from a very human level. We might attempt to make some sense of the language, to discover what function the poetic elements serve, to uncover a point behind the poem we believe the author is providing. These are all valid ways to understand what is in front of us, and they are certainly at the root of analyzing literature. However, there are academic schools of thought in the field of literature called literary criticism. Now, literary criticism is a discipline concerned with the range of inquiries about literature. Criticism pursues such root questions as what literature is, what it does, and what the worth of literature is. This chapter deals mostly with general outlines of the more prominent 20th century critical theories. The Western critical theory has been in place since the 4th century BC, and has had a range of movements since. The 20th century provided a time of radical reappraising of traditional theoretical approaches to literature. And while there are a number of theories and models not represented in this chapter, those which appear here ought to give a variety of perspectives and critical approaches for many types of poems. In applying them to your reading, you may find that there are some poems crying out for the application of a specific theory. Take one, for example, Linda Paston's poem Marx, on which we may find fitting well with a feminist theory reading. On the other hand, there might be poems which are more subtly approached and may have various possibilities as to what theoretical considerations you would give them. But before we tackle these more contemporary approaches, let's scan a bit of history behind critical theory first. And here on page 20 in the corner, as always, he gives us a quote, this time from William Stafford, a poet and teacher who I love. And William Stafford said, "It is a great river of possibilities, language swirling around us all the time. People talk to each other. They come upon swoops of realization and vistas. Even the syllables have meaning." Now, Professor Knorr continues here. The Western tradition of literary theory is rooted in Plato's writings from the 4th century BC. In his Republic, Plato indicted poets on 2 counts, that they simply imitated what they observed, and that the art appealed to the worst in human nature. But a generation after Plato, these claims were countered by Aristotle in his work entitled Poetics. In this, he developed a set of principles for literary composition which have been of lasting importance in the Western tradition of literature. These rules functioned around the notion that time, action, and place were the 3 unifying forces in a literary work, and the Aristotelian approach was largely observed until nearly the end of the 17th century. The Renaissance provided a time of some shift in literary approach, and one of the more notable and well-known works in The Defense of Poesy, written at the end of the 16th century by Sir Philip Sidney. While much of the literary thought of that era focused on the moral worth of literature and the relationship of literature to reality, Sidney added to this a concept, still in practice today, that it is the responsibility of poetry, of all literature, to present moral and philosophical arguments and truths in a manner which pulls them from the abstract and makes them immediately concrete for the reader. While this notion has remained for some time, nearly a century after Sidney's dissertation and assertion, John Dryden claimed that the primary concern of literature should be to offer delight and instruction through an accurate representation of the world. This is and was often taken to mean art for the sake of entertainment that instructs. This idea remained at the core of literary thought through the 18th century, and as a residual effect, by viewing the art and cultural practices of the time, it is evident they aristocracy of Europe especially believed in this idea. Now, the 19th century brought great change as the Romantics were furiously shifting from what they viewed as a constrictive and narrow path of the previous century. Among many, William Wordsworth was a ground-breaking poet, advocating in favor of ethos. He believed that the poet is a speaker whose feelings and expressions are to be seen as, quote, carried alive into the heart by passion. This notion linked directly to the Aristotelian idea, and it also rubbed against principles from the near centuries that art was concerned with the moral quandaries of the time, which largely translated to religious dilemmas. Now, later in the 19th century, we see the development of other core ideas revolving around culture and the role of art. The aesthetic theory developing at this time was the art for art's sake principle, and the poet and theorist Matthew Arnold believed that poetics, indeed art altogether, should take over the cultural and moral role that religion had played in previous centuries. Indeed, this was a dramatic shift that sent the artistic and theoretic worlds into prolific change throughout the 20th century. Now, we've witnessed in our recent past century theorists building on all of this past thinking and reevaluating some of its usefulness. While much of the early 20th century literary theory revolved around the Russian formalists from the 1920s, theorists in the later part of the century began to call into question the importance of the author as connected to the text's meaning. These theorists believed that meaning was not derived from what the author intended to say, the author's past, or the social historical conditions from which the author came. Rather, the meaning of a text was generated by language and culture. So now that we've reached the 20th century, the following critical theories will provide you some critical approaches from our near past. The following outlines of theories may help your understanding of poems, further your discussions, or provide you with an analytical framework with which you may write about a poem. It's important to remember that while applying the critical approaches what the author has written, what you think you see as the author's point may not agree with what the critic observes and concludes. Good. Now, before I continue on here, I just want to acknowledge Professor Noor presents us, with a lot of information there in just 2 pages, right? So again, my focus here is not that you understand the history of literature and literary criticism for the last 2,000 years, right? So I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of the things that Professor Noor is talking about on these pages, but this background is very helpful as we look at the next few pages here, because what we will see is sort of the different ways to analyze a poem. Or if you imagine a critic reading, a professional critic, reading a poem, they could choose to analyze it from a series of possible viewpoints. Imagine sort of different lenses is a really common metaphor that you use when we talk about literary criticism here. That I'm reading a book and I'm putting on my feminist lens, or my Marxist lens, or my aesthetic lens, or whatever. And we're going to look at some of these specific lenses from the 20th century next. But I just wanted to say, don't get too overwhelmed about the full 2,000-year history of poetry in Western civilization. That's not the point. The real value in looking at some of these things on page 20 and 21 is to give you background and to understand these sort of different lenses that we're going to continue on with here. So, some schools of thought. Archetypal theory. This literary theory is primarily concerned with discovering how the major themes or motifs in a poem or any other literary work are related to recurring patterns of characters, images, and narratives. This theory is based on the notion that images and narratives are structured and only important according to their connections to archetypal models throughout human history. These characters, images, and narrative structures would be identifiably related to archetypes from a variety of dreams, myth, and modes of social behavior. And if you want more information about archetypes, you could just Google archetype, of course. But if you want to, you could Google Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey. You could Google Carl Jung, that's Jung, the very famous psychologist and sort of collaborator and sometimes enemy, or not enemy, but competitor of Freud. They played with these ideas of archetypes in really big and important ways. So that'd be something like even the mother archetype, the idea of a mother what that is, what that means. What does a mother look like? What does a mother do? This image of the mother as an archetype has been with human beings for a very, very, very long time. So that's the idea of an archetype, and you can get more information about it, like I said, by Google Jung archetype, and you can go down the rabbit hole if you want. It's interesting. So here on 22, deconstruction. This method of analysis assumes that language refers to and is connected only to itself rather than any reality outside the text. The text is therefore related to the social, cultural, and political use and implications of the language, which may indeed raise multiple conflicting interpretations. However, these interpretations supersede any author intent perceived by the reader. Deconstruction takes apart the standard logic of language which authors use to make claims and structure a work. Hence, deconstruction sets out to illustrate how text will subvert itself, because there are nuances of positions opposite to the position that the author and text set out to uphold or solve. Finally, deconstruction demonstrates that every text generates innumerable contradictory and indeterminate meanings. Yeah, and what to say about this? In one paragraph, Professor Knorr talks about something that you could take an entire class on. So again, the idea is that the author's intent is irrelevant, right? And that meaning comes to us conditioned by the context that we bring to it and that the word brings to us. So the idea is to deconstruct, to break down each individual element of a piece of literature, whether that's a short story or a poem, and analyze that for what it is. And as Professor Knorr here emphasizes, this every text generates innumerable contradictory and indeterminate meanings. Again, that's a big philosophical idea. So yeah, pick it up and play with that one as much as you want. We're not really going to spend a lot of time with that one in this class. Now, one that's a little more practical is feminist theory. Feminist theory examines the ways in which literature has been shaped according to gender. This theoretical approach explores privilege based on sexual difference in the form and content, production, reception, analysis, and evaluation of literature. 3 core principles applied to the feminist approach are: 1, that the Western world has been a patriarchal culture and subjugates women to men in the majority of cultural roles. 2, while sex is determined by anatomy, gender is defined socially. Masculine gender has historically been ascribed the dominant features that the culture finds socially valuable, while the feminine has been ascribed passive, acquiescent features Western culture derides. And 3, patriarchal ideology pervades the literary canon and has largely been written by men for men. And the analysis and critiques of such work are filled with masculine assumptions, interests, and reasoning. Hence, a resultant factor of feminist theory has been a move to identify female subject matter, the exploration and discovery of a female world literary history, and distinguishing a female feminine experience. Again, hopefully that makes sense and is clear, but feminist theory is the idea of putting on a lens, right, when you're viewing art or reading literature or reading poetry, woman's lens, right? And understanding that gender is a social construction, understanding that in the West, male gender has traditionally been the most, come with the most power and privilege, and understanding literature through that lens. And how does that affect the way that people wrote, men and women wrote, and how does that affect the way that we perceive literature and poems? Next, formalism. Formalist theory flourished in the 1920s from a Russian school of literary theorists. The formalists viewed literature by paying close attention to the style, arrangement, or the artistic approach. These theorists de-emphasized content and analyzed the text itself relative to formal aspects of a literary work, feeling it was important to view the text as separate from biographical, social, political, or psychological contexts. So here, I've just sort of summarized this really quickly as this is about content, not context, right? This is about looking at language for language's sake without worrying too much about putting it into a specific context, as Professor Knorr says here in terms of biographical information about the author, or social or political or psychological issues that were happening at the time. Then we have the Geneva School, the phenomenology theory. This group of theorists popularized their work in the 1930s. They believed that a literary work exposed the personality of an author, and this was a reason to read literature. Because writing is an intentional act directed by the author, by reading the entire body of work by an author, it is possible to reach a conclusion about the writer's vision of himself or herself and the world. They were likely to focus on attitudes of the author, obsessions shown in the writing, and political notions arising in a body of work. A really interesting way to approach literature and literary theory. But of course, in this class, we're not going to do a deep dive. We're not going to read every um, Emily Dickinson poem, for example. So again, you can always get more information about these theories by Googling them. Or if you'd like more information about one in particular, you can always send me a text, send me an email, and I can sort of send you some additional resources. Now, continuing on page 23 with Marxist theory. Marxist criticism typically explains a literary work by viewing it in the context of its historical time. Therefore, the poem, play, novel, or story is not viewed as a timeless piece of literature. Rather, the reader needs to closely analyze the economic, political, and religious ideology of that specific time and place. In applying Marxist theory, it is important to view the positions and interests of particular classes and how they work as typically competing forces in a literary work. For example, the reader might analyze how characters from the dominant social and economic class might further their interests over the working class. I don't have too much to say about that one. I think it makes sense. New historicism. Now, influenced by Marxist theory, new historicism approaches literature as a representative of a historical and cultural setting. When applying new historicism, the reader must analyze the historical, social, and cultural implications of a literary work, and then extend the analysis to the historical period in which the work was produced. Therefore, the critic analyzes literature as interacting with history, not simply as a product of a given time, and the point of reading literature is to uncover the ideology of that historical period. I'm just going to highlight that last sentence. Because, if you've taken class long enough with me now, you can probably tell that I talk about context a lot. So I wouldn't say that I'm a new historicist, but this idea of literature and poetry being in dialogue, in conversation with culture, history, time, place, and the author themselves, it does make a lot of sense to me. But again, I'm not fighting for one of these theories over the other. Now, psychoanalytic or psychological theory. This theoretical school is largely based on Freud's model of the ego, superego, and is as well as theory about authors and artists being sophisticated beings able to control sexual desires for such a higher goal as art. Hence, this criticism analyzes one, a piece of literature in the context of the author's psychological conflicts. 2, a reader's responses to literature. And 3, it may make assumptions of the psychological life of an author by viewing unconscious revelations in the writing. This theory also includes work by Carl Jung's archetypal theory that in the human unconscious we possess a collective body of archetypal models. Therefore, a reader might analyze a piece of literature viewing how an author or character responds to an archetypal human situation. Then we have reader response theory. This school of literary criticism believes that individual readers recreate the text, and each person may read something varied in its meaning based on his or her own experience. Therefore, the reader response critic is engaged in an analysis of the reader-author relationship, discerning ambiguities, the reader's role in filling in gaps the author may have left, creating a set of assumptions in order to navigate the poem, and the reader's inferences that he or she creates in order to understand the work. Because the author has put incentives to the reader's responses and limitations to the work, some analyses may be rejected. And I'll just tell you honestly, I do not know too much about the reader response theory. This is one that I've read a little bit about, but it wasn't something that when I was doing my bachelor's degree in English literature, it was not something that I met either in fiction or in poetry. So I don't have too much information about that one. Finally, structuralism. This school of literary thought was based on the idea that language and culture are both structures that can be analyzed and understood by viewing their systems of signs and symbols. Therefore, the structuralist critic analyzes a piece of literature as a series of interlocking signs, linguistic and cultural, I'm highlighting that, which fit together as a piece of the larger set of rules that governs all literature. Structuralists will consider all of the areas of the humanities as structures to consider in their analysis, i.e., anthropology, sociology, politics, religion, and by gaining access from these various fields, the significance of a poem may be obtained. Now, of course, the theories of literary criticism mentioned here are not all the schools of thought, but a sampling of the many critical theories that burgeoned, that grew in the 20th century. You might find yourself gravitating to one of these theories that suits your manner of thinking and suits your sense of approaching poetry. You may find that for the sense of sitting on your couch and enjoying a poem one afternoon, maybe you're flipping through an anthology for pleasure, the last thing you want to do is apply academic critical theory. Rather, you want to place the poem in your own life and simply enjoy the language. And that's fine. However, when engaging in group discussions about poetry and for writing papers about poems, you'll probably wish to engage in a more critical discussion that analyzes the poem from one of these various angles. Now, for a bit of initial practice, read the following poems and apply a critical theory to each of them, creating an interpretation based in critical theory. And I'll read through these poems here and talk through them a little bit. But again, this is not really about having the right or wrong answer. It's about reading and responding to these poems and seeing if any of these theories that we just sort of talked about really fits. So let's start here on page 24 with Marks by Linda Paston. My husband gives me an A for last night's supper, an incomplete for my ironing, and a B+ in bed. My son says I'm average, an average mother, but if I put my mind to it, I could improve. My daughter believes in pass-fail and tells me I pass. Wait till they learn I'm dropping out. So what do you think? I mean, my mind goes straight to the feminist theory, right? This is clearly a poem written by a female author. They're talking about, she's talking about her relationship to her husband, her son. So in a certain way, she's taking up the identity of wife, which is, typically, historically here, I want to be careful and respectful, a woman's role, right? A mother, woman's role, right? And she's sort of reflecting on their judgment of her, right? So that could be an interesting way to do it. Maybe one of these other approaches you think fits even better than that. I'm not sure. If you wanted to do Marxist or New Historicism or any of those things, you might need more information about the author, when she wrote the poem, the culture she lived in, etc. If you wanted to do this psychoanalytic or psychological theory approach, which is especially interested in the human psychology, the unconscious, and sexuality, well, we do have a comment here about her sexual relationship with her husband, this comment about a B+ in bed, so you could analyze her psychology and what all that stuff means. So again, you could do any of those different approaches, but again, my first response would be to approach this poem from a feminist perspective. What would you do? I'm going to continue, but if you want to think about it or go back and reread anything, please do that. Take your time. I'm going to keep going. So the next poem is here on 25, and it's What Work Is by Philip Levine. We stand in the rain in a long line, waiting at Ford Highland Park for work. You know what work is. If you're old enough to read this, you know what work is, although you may not do it. Forget you. This is about waiting, shifting from one foot to another, feeling the light rain falling like mist into your hair, blurring your vision until you think you see your own brother ahead of you, maybe 10 places. You rub your glasses with your finger, and of course it's someone else's brother, narrower across the shoulders than yours, but with the same sad slouch, the grin that does not hide the stubbornness, the sad refusal to give in to rain, to the hours wasted waiting, to the knowledge that somewhere ahead a man is waiting who will say, no, we're not hiring today, for any reason he wants. You love your brother. Now suddenly you can hardly stand the love flooding you for your brother, who's not beside you or behind you or ahead because he's home trying to sleep off a miserable night shift at Cadillac so he can get up before noon to study his German. Works 8 hours a night so he can sing Wagner, the opera you hate most, the worst music ever invented. How long has it been since you told him you loved him, held his wide shoulders, opened your eyes wide and said those words and maybe kissed his cheek? You've never done something so simple, so obvious. Not because you're too young or too dumb, not because you're jealous or even mean or incapable of crying in the presence of another man, no. Just because you don't know what work is. Right? Interesting. Again, I'll just point out a few things. I don't want to take up the whole time. We can talk about this in class, in our live meetings. But again, at the beginning of the poem, he sort of says the third line here, you know what work is, right? And then we get this idea of him waiting in line for a job that we're connecting to work. And then at the end, he says, just because you don't know what work is, right? The reason that you haven't told your brother how much you loved him, hugged him, kissed him, is because you don't know what work is. So there's a lot going on in that poem already, right? And then when we think about some of the literary theories, very naturally, right? Marxism, if you remember correctly on page 23, was talking a lot about economies, work, jobs, social classes, right? So this issue of class, work, money certainly comes out. And at the same time, again, if you wanted to do a psychological, psychoanalytical approach, we do have some very deep and interesting things about human psychology, how we feel, strong emotions and feelings that the persona, the speaker in the poem here talks about his relationship to his brother, right? So there's this strong connection of what is work, what is not work, what's the most important thing in life, work to make money or work to have a deep, loving connection to your brother in this example, right? And just to throw it out there as well, we could do this from a feminist perspective as well, because this is a man in the poem. The persona is a man talking about his relationship to his brother, right? And this idea of, well, men don't really share their emotions. Men don't really hug and touch and kiss and love each other, at least in the United States. That's not as common. So what does this tell us about gender stuff, this poem? And that the persona here connects emotion, love, between two men to work, right? What does that mean? I don't know. You could write a whole paper about it. But just more examples of how we could apply different theories to the same poem. All right, continuing on. Page 26, Blink Your Eyes by Siku Sundiata. Remembering Sterling A. Brown. I was on my way to see my woman, but the law said I was on my way through a red light, red light, red light. And if you saw my woman, you could understand. I was just being a man. It wasn't about no light, it was about my ride. And if you saw my ride, you could dig that too, you dig. Sunroof, stereo, radio, black leather, bucket seats sit low, The body's cool, but the tires are worn. Ride when the hard times come, ride when they're gone. In other words, the light was green. I could wake up in the morning without a warning, and my world could change. Blink your eyes. All depends. All depends on the skin. All depends on the skin you're living in. Up to the window comes the law with his hand on his gun. What's up? What's happening? I said, I guess that's when I really broke the law. He said, a routine, step out the car. A routine, assume the position. Put your hands up in the air. You know the routine, like you just don't care. License and registration. Deep was the night and the light from the North Star on the car door. Deja vu, we've been through this before. Why did you stop me? Somebody has to stop you. I watch the news. You always lose. You're unreliable. That's undeniable. This is serious. You could be dangerous. And I could wake up in the morning without a warning, and my world could change. Blink your eyes. All depends. All depends on the skin. All depends on the skin you're living in. New York City, they got laws, can no brothers drive outdoors. In certain neighborhoods, on a particular streets, near and around certain types of people, they got laws. All depends. All depends on the skin. All depends on the skin you're living in. What you think? I mean, I go right to context on this one, right? This is about, we know it's in New York City. This is obviously about black men, police. They're playing with language and the use of language here. This is sort of one of the varieties of English. Could be African American English, right? Could be influenced by other sort of non-mainstream, privileged, empowered, academic type of white Englishes. What do you think? We could talk about this poem for 2 weeks. So go back, read over the theories, and see which one you think applies to this one. We got one more poem to read. On page 27, Poem for the Young White Man Who Asked Me How I, an intelligent, well-read person, could believe in the war between races, by Lorna D. Cervantes. In my land, there are no distinctions. The barbed wire politics of oppression have been torn down long ago. The only reminder of past battles, lost or won, is a slight rutting of the fertile fields. In my land, people write poems about love, full of nothing but contented, childlike syllables. Everyone reads Russian short stories and weeps. There are no boundaries. There is no hunger, no complicated famine or greed. I am not a revolutionary. I don't even like political poems. Do you think I can believe in a war between races? I can deny it. I can forget about it when I'm safe, living on my own continent of harmony and home, but I am not there. I believe in revolution because everywhere the crosses are burning, sharp-shooting goose-steppers round every corner. There are snipers in the schools. I know you don't believe this. You think this is nothing but faddish exaggeration, but they are not shooting at you. I'm marked by the color of my skin. The bullets are discreet and designed to kill slowly. They are aiming at my children. These are facts. Let me show you my wounds, my stumbling mind, my tongue, and this nagging preoccupation with the feeling of not being good enough. These bullets bury deeper than logic. Racism is not intellectual. I cannot reason these scars away. Outside my door there is a real enemy who hates me. I am a poet who yearns to dance on rooftops, to whisper delicate lines about joy and the blessings of human understanding. I try. I go to my land, my tower of words, and bolt the door, but the typewriter doesn't fade out the sounds of blasting and muffled outrage. My own days bring me slaps on the face. Every day I am deluged with reminders that this is not my land. And this is my land. I do not believe in the war between races. But in this country there is a war.